It began with a sealed document quietly delivered through the side entrance of Balmoral Castle, a document so sensitive that even senior courtiers reportedly refused to discuss it aloud. But when Lady Louise Windsor emerged from that private meeting with red eyes and a trembling expression, the silence surrounding Prince Philip's final wishes suddenly became impossible to contain. What had long been dismissed as speculation was now confirmed by trustees themselves. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For months, whispers had moved quietly through the corridors of the House of Windsor, appearing in fragments, disappearing just as quickly, buried beneath official engagements and carefully managed palace distractions. Yet, according to various interpretations emerging from royal insiders, the rumors surrounding Philip's beloved riding estate were never entirely without substance. Sources close to the Highland staff reportedly claimed that trustees overseeing the late Duke's private equestrian sanctuary had finally reached an internal conclusion regarding the future of the property, and at the center of that decision stood Louise herself. Not Prince William, not senior courtiers, not even powerful royal advisors who allegedly believed the land should remain under tighter institutional oversight. Instead, the estate reportedly became tied to the quiet granddaughter Philip, trusted in ways few outside the family ever fully understood. What made the revelation so explosive was not merely the inheritance itself, but the emotional gravity attached to it. Those familiar with Philip's routines at Balmoral often described the riding grounds as far more than countryside acreage. It was reportedly his sanctuary from palace politics, his refuge from ceremonial exhaustion, and perhaps the last place where the famously iron-willed Duke felt completely untethered from the suffocating machinery of monarchy. Insiders whisper that Philip guarded those traditions fiercely, particularly during his final years. When concerns about health and succession increasingly consumed royal discussions behind closed doors. And somewhere within that private world, Louise reportedly became a steady and trusted presence. Palace administrative streams, ranging from former staff observations to aristocratic sile whispers, now suggest aides were quietly instructed to avoid public discussion of the matter altogether. That level of silence reportedly alarmed even veteran royal correspondents. Why such secrecy over a riding estate? Why were conversations allegedly shut down the moment Louise's name surfaced? According to some insiders, tensions had already begun forming behind palace walls long before trustees finalized anything officially. Different interpretations of those internal disagreements describe a growing unease surrounding who expected influence over Philip's cherished legacy once he was gone. Some reportedly viewed the Balmoral riding grounds as symbolic territory tied directly to royal hierarchy, prestige, and long-term influence within the family itself. Meanwhile, Louise remained almost entirely silent. No interviews, no public statements, no visible attempt to involve herself in the growing speculation. Reports suggest both Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, privately encouraged their daughter to stay grounded while the process unfolded quietly behind the scenes. Those close to the family allegedly described the emotional burden on Louise as overwhelming, not because of the estate's value, but because of what it represented emotionally. Royal insiders increasingly characterized the trustees' confirmation as deeply symbolic, suggesting Philip's decision was rooted not in status or protocol, but in personal trust built over years of shared devotion to the traditions he held sacred. And perhaps that is the detail now haunting palace observers the most. Why Louise? Why would Philip reportedly place such emotional weight on the granddaughter who rarely sought public attention, avoided royal theatrics, and quietly carried herself far from the chaos that has increasingly surrounded modern monarchy? Some believe the answer lies in the Duke's lifelong distrust of spectacle. Others suggest he saw in Louise the same discipline, restraint, and loyalty that once defined an older generation of royals now slowly disappearing from public life. But the emotional weight surrounding the estate was never really about land or horses. It was about the final private bond Prince Philip protected until the very end. Long before the trustees spoke publicly, there were whispers throughout royal circles that Prince Philip saw something of himself in Lady Louise Windsor, a quiet resilience, a love of discipline, and an almost obsessive devotion to carriage driving that few younger royals ever shared. At first, those whispers were dismissed as harmless family sentiment, the kind of quiet affection older royals often develop toward younger grandchildren. But according to sources close to the Windsor household, the connection between Philip and Louise reportedly ran far deeper than casual favoritism. Insiders claim the late Duke spent years carefully mentoring her in the traditions that had defined much of his private life, especially the demanding world of carriage driving and countryside discipline that he believed modern royal culture was slowly abandoning. Unlike the public-facing glamour attached to royal ceremonies, Philip's world at Balmoral reportedly revolved around routine, endurance, precision, and silence. And for reasons many inside the monarchy allegedly struggled to understand, Louise seemed completely at home within it. Various interpretations from former staff members suggest Philip's attachment to Balmoral riding grounds became even more emotional during the later years of his life. Those lands were never merely recreative, communal spaces to him. They reportedly represented order in a world increasingly overtaken by palace turbulence, media intrusion, and generational division. Sources close to the Highland estate whisper that Philip guarded those traditions fiercely, often retreating there not simply for privacy, but to escape the growing noise surrounding the monarchy itself. And within that isolated rhythm of carriage routes, riding customs, and long-standing estate rituals, Louise allegedly became his most trusted companion. Royal staff reportedly witnessed Philip personally teaching Louise details few others ever bothered to learn. Not ceremonial duties, not public appearances, but the customs of stewardship itself. How the grounds were maintained, why certain routines mattered, why discipline, in Philip's mind, separated duty from performance. Palace insiders now claim he admired Louise precisely because she never appeared interested in royal spectacle. One former aide allegedly described her as the royal who listened instead of performed, a phrase that has quietly echoed through aristocratic circles ever since the Trustees' confirmation surfaced publicly. The comparisons between Louise and Philip reportedly became impossible for some palace figures to ignore. Both were described as deeply reserved, uncomfortable with unnecessary attention, and far more practical than emotional in public settings. Reports suggest Philip saw in Louise a reflection of values he feared were disappearing from the institution he spent decades defending. While others pursued visibility, influence, or public approval, Louise reportedly gravitated toward privacy, routine, and responsibility. To Philip, according to those familiar with his thinking, that difference mattered enormously. But perhaps the most revealing detail lies in what insiders now claim Philip feared most. Sources suggest he became increasingly protective of the riding estate because he worried it could eventually fall victim to what one royal historian allegedly called social prestige politics. In other words, the estate risked becoming less about preserving tradition and more about status, symbolism, and quiet power struggles among competing royal interests. Philip reportedly despised that possibility. To him, Balmoral's riding grounds were never luxury property to be flaunted or politically leveraged. They were sacred royalty, territory tied to continuity, discipline, and identity itself. That belief may explain why palace historians now quietly describe Louise as the natural spiritual successor to Philip's countryside legacy. Not because she sought it, not because she campaigned for influence, but because she reportedly understood the emotional weight behind it in ways others never truly did. Yet the closer Louise grew to Philip's world, the more certain figures inside the monarchy reportedly began watching the situation with growing unease. At first, the disagreements were subtle, carefully worded concerns raised during private estate discussions, polite objections buried beneath royal protocol. But insiders now whisper that once Prince Philip's intentions became clearer, the atmosphere surrounding Balmoral Castle changed completely. According to various interpretations emerging from palace administrative circles, the tension did not begin with open confrontation. It reportedly started with assumptions, quiet expectations. Certain senior figures inside the royal structure allegedly believed Philip's beloved riding estate would eventually become part of a broader redistribution tied to the monarchy's long-term future. Some assumed control would naturally shift toward more senior royal households. Others reportedly viewed the land as an institutional royal asset, rather than a deeply personal legacy. But as whispers surrounding Lady Louise Windsor grew stronger, those assumptions allegedly began collapsing one by one, and with them came a wave of unease that few palace aides were prepared to manage. Sources close to the discussions claimed trustees overseeing the estate soon found themselves under quiet but increasing pressure regarding the long-term control of the riding grounds. Not direct hostility, not public disputes. The monarchy rarely functions that way behind closed doors. Instead, according to insiders, concerns surfaced through carefully measured conversations disguised as practical questions about optics, continuity, and modernization. Why should such a significant estate remain attached to one branch of the family? Would the public understand the symbolism? Could the inheritance create uncomfortable headlines during a period when the monarchy was already struggling to maintain stability? Those questions reportedly echoed through private meetings for months. At the same time, palace officials allegedly feared something even more dangerous than internal disagreement: public perception. Reports suggest administrative advisors worried the inheritance could ignite accusations of favoritism, privilege, or outdated aristocratic traditions at a moment when public scrutiny surrounding royal wealth had already intensified dramatically. Some insiders now claim there were quiet discussions about whether parts of Philip's countryside legacy should be modernized, repurposed, or institutionally absorbed in order to avoid controversy altogether. But that idea reportedly collided headfirst with the Duke's deeply traditional worldview, a worldview many Balmoral staff members remained fiercely loyal to even after his passing. Rumors of private disagreements soon spread beyond legal discussions and into broader ideological divisions, quietly shaping the future of the monarchy itself. According to royal commentators, the issues surrounding the riding estate exposed a hidden generational fracture inside the House of Windsor. On one side were those who believed royal traditions survived only through preservation, discipline, and continuity. On the other stood figures who all allegedly viewed adaptation, modernization, and public optics as essential for survival in a rapidly changing world. And somehow, Louise unintentionally found herself standing directly at the center of that divide. Throughout the growing tension, Louise reportedly withdrew even further from public attention. Sources suggest she deliberately avoided appearances during the most sensitive stages of negotiation, unwilling to fuel media speculation or deepen palace anxieties already spiraling behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, allegedly worked quietly as intermediaries, attempting to calm competing concerns while protecting Louise from the increasingly political atmosphere surrounding the inheritance. Those familiar with Edward's role describe him as deeply aware of how emotionally personal the estate remained to Philip, while Sophie reportedly focused on shielding Louise from the growing emotional pressure attached to the controversy. Yet despite the palace maneuvering, one obstacle reportedly refused to bend: the loyalty of the Balmoral staff themselves. Sources close to the Highland estate claim many longtime staff members remained unwavering in and their support for Philip's original wishes, believing the riding grounds represented something sacred that could not simply be reshaped to satisfy institutional convenience or royal politics. And as those loyalties hardened, the quiet disagreements reportedly evolved into something far more serious than inheritance negotiations alone. But the real shock came when trustees reportedly uncovered documents that revealed just how deliberate Prince Philip's decision had always been. The turning point reportedly arrived inside a private legal review attended by trustees, estate officials, and senior royal advisors, where forgotten papers linked to Prince Philip's personal directives were finally brought forward, shifting everything previously assumed about the fate of his cherished riding estate tied to Balmoral Castle. What had begun as a routine verification of estate succession quickly transformed into something far more significant. According to sources familiar with the proceedings, trustees allegedly confirmed the existence of written guidance that had remained quietly archived, untouched for years, yet carrying unmistakable weight in its clarity. These were not ceremonial notes or vague suggestions. They were described by insiders as structured, deliberate instructions tied directly to the preservation of Philip's equestrian legacy. The language reportedly emphasized continuity above all else, a strict devotion to discipline, and an unwavering belief that stewardship of the land mattered more than status or symbolism. As those documents were carefully reviewed, the atmosphere inside the room reportedly shifted. Conversations slowed, then stopped entirely. Palace insiders claim that silence settled with unusual force, the kind of silence that signals not confusion, but realization. Because within those pages, the role of Lady Louise Windsor was no longer speculative. No longer interpretative, it was unmistakably embedded in Philip's own vision for what should endure after him. What had once been whispered in corridors suddenly became unavoidable fact inside the legal framework of the estate itself. Those present reportedly described the documents as deeply personal rather than ceremonial, a distinction that changed everything. This was not about titles, inheritance optics, or administrative redistribution. It was about identity, about continuity through life, ed tradition rather than institutional assignment. Royal commentators later noted that Philip's lifelong devotion to equestrian culture was not simply a pastime, but a defining structure of his private world. Something he protected with almost military precision. The estate, in that sense, was never just land, it was memory, discipline, and legacy bound together. When Louise's name was fully acknowledged in that context, insiders claim her reaction was immediate and visibly emotional. Not theatrical, not performative, but controlled, quiet, and deeply affected. Those familiar with royal proceedings say it was rare to see such a response in an environment defined by restraint, protocol, and composure. Yet in that moment, the weight of what Philip had intended reportedly became undeniable, pressing down on everyone in the room with a sense of irreversible clarity. Royal experts now describe the estate itself as emotionally priceless within Windsor history, not because of its financial scale, but because of its symbolic density. It represented a private continuity thread between generations, one that bypassed the usual structures of royal visibility and hierarchy. And as that understanding settled in, speculation began to intensify almost immediately. If Philip had been this deliberate, this precise in shaping the future of his writing legacy, then he would have been the master of his own destiny. Then what did that imply about everything that had happened before the documents were revealed? Within palace circles, that question reportedly began to reshape how Louise herself was viewed, no longer only as a quiet presence within the wider royal family, but as someone unexpectedly positioned at the intersection of legacy and expectation. Some insiders suggest this revelation could subtly influence how her role is perceived in the years ahead, not through formal elevation, but through the emotional authority attached to Philip's final intentions. And while the confirmation settled one question, it immediately ignited another far more explosive one. Why had the palace worked so hard to keep it hidden? For months, Lady Louise Windsor remained silent, while rumors spread across tabloids, royal forums, and palace corridors. But according to sources close to the Windsor household, that silence finally broke after the trustees' confirmation made secrecy impossible to maintain within the emotional weight of Prince Philip's writing, a legacy tied to Balmoral Castle. At first, that silence was not unusual. Louise had long been known for her restraint, her distance from public spectacle, and her refusal to be drawn into the louder currents of royal life. But insiders now claim this moment was different. The confirmation reportedly created an emotional pressure that could no longer remain internal. Sources suggest Louise spoke privately about preserving Philip's traditions with dignity. Not as a symbolic gesture, but as a responsibility she felt deeply rather than inherited lightly. There was no ambition in her response. No sense of entitlement, only a quiet understanding that something deeply personal had been entrusted to her by a figure whose influence shaped much of her upbringing. Royal insiders described the emotional burden she carried as unusually heavy, not because of public expectation alone, but because of what Philip represented in her life. According to those familiar with the family dynamic, Louise had long viewed the writing estate not as a privilege to be showcased, but as a duty to be protected. That distinction reportedly shaped every reaction she had in the aftermath of the trustees' decision. While Public narratives began forming around her name, she remained focused on the core idea Philip had always emphasized: continuity over attention, discipline over display. Throughout this period, Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, allegedly played a stabilizing role behind the scenes, encouraging Louise to remain grounded as media attention quietly intensified. Sources suggest their guidance was not about strategy or public image, but emotional balance, helping her navigate a situation that was becoming larger than any single moment within the family. Their presence reportedly provided a sense of calm amid a rapidly expanding narrative that risked overwhelming the personal nature of what had been intended. Meanwhile, commentators observing from outside the palace began highlighting Louise's restraint in stark contrast to other, more publicly volatile royal disputes. Her silence was no longer seen as absence, but as control. Her measured response began to shift perception, with some describing her as one of the few younger royals capable of maintaining composure under sustained scrutiny. Within Balmoral itself, staff reportedly responded warmly to her involvement, viewing her presence not as disruption but as continuity, a living link to the traditions Philip had guarded so closely during his lifetime. Reports now suggest Louise intends to protect the estate's historic character with careful attention, avoiding unnecessary modernization that could dilute its identity. This approach, according to insiders, mirrors Philip's own philosophy more closely than anyone anticipated. And as these details quietly spread through royal circles, palace observers have begun referring to her in a new way, not as a figure stepping into prominence, but as one of the monarchy's quiet future anchors, holding stability through presence rather than performance. But beneath the public sympathy and emotional headlines, the inheritance carried a deeper meaning, one that reached far beyond Balmoral itself. In the end, this was never simply about who inherited a riding estate tucked within the mist-covered Scottish landscape. According to royal historians, Prince Philip's final gesture toward Lady Louise Windsor represented something far larger: a passing of values in an institution increasingly consumed by uncertainty, with the quiet gravity of Balmoral Castle standing as its emotional center. Across royal analysis and historical interpretation, the estate is now being framed not as property, but as continuity itself. Experts who have long studied the House of Windsor suggest that Philip's decision reflects an older tradition of personal stewardship, where legacy was not distributed through spectacle or hierarchy alone, but through trust earned in silence and discipline. In that framing, the riding grounds become more than land, they become a living thread connecting past values to an uncertain present, holding together an identity that modern pressures continually challenge. Within that narrative, Louise increasingly emerges as a figure defined by something rare in contemporary royal life, what commentators describe as duty without performance. Not driven by visibility, not shaped by ambition, but anchored in consistency and restraint. Those who observe the monarchy closely argue that this distinction is precisely what made Philip's recognition of her so significant. It was not elevation through ceremony, but recognition through understanding and alignment of temperament rather than status. Reports suggest that King Charles III quietly respected Philip, their intentions throughout the process, even amid the emotional complexity surrounding inheritance and legacy within the royal structure. While the monarchy often operates under layers of institutional expectation, insiders claim there was an awareness that this particular decision carried a personal logic that could not easily be redirected. In that sense, Charles's restraint is described by some commentators as an acknowledgement of something deeper than administrative choice, a recognition of emotional continuity within the family's private world. Meanwhile, Balmoral itself remains central to how this moment is interpreted. Royal historians often describe it as more than a residence. It is the emotional landscape of the monarchy, where public duty and private identity overlap in ways few other royal spaces allow. In that context, Philip's connection to the estate, and now Louise's association with it, is seen as part of a longer emotional lineage that defines the institution's internal memory. As public discussion grows, commentators increasingly argue that the moment has quietly strengthened Louise's long-term standing within the royal narrative. Not through publicity, but through perception. not through elevation, but through association with continuity. Some palace insiders have even described the inheritance as a victory for tradition over ambition, a phrase that reflects the ongoing tension between preservation and change within the monarchy's evolving identity. And within that tension, Philip's memory is no longer spoken of only in historical terms. Instead, it is increasingly portrayed as something still active, still influencing the shape of royal continuity through those he trusted most. In that interpretation, his presence does not end, it transforms, living on through Louise's quiet commitment to the values he guarded so fiercely. And as the gates of Balmoral closed once more under the cold Highland skies, one truth reportedly lingered inside the royal household above all others. The moment news of the Trustees' confirmation leaked beyond royal circles, the atmosphere inside the palace reportedly shifted from guarded secrecy to full containment mode. What had once been treated as a private family matter was suddenly becoming an international royal controversy surrounding Lady Louise Windsor, the legacy of Prince Philip, and the deeply symbolic very height of Balmoral Castle. According to sources close to palace operations, communications teams allegedly moved with unusual urgency as headlines began escalating beyond expected boundaries. What started as quiet speculation in royal forums quickly transformed into a global narrative, one that palace advisors could no longer contain through routine briefing strategies. Insiders suggest that every line released, every carefully phrased statement, was designed not just to clarify, but to control a growing perception that something far more significant than inheritance was unfolding within the House of Windsor. Royal commentators soon began debating a more uncomfortable possibility: whether Philip had intended this reaction all along. Some interpretations suggest the Duke's decision, rather than being purely personal, may have carried a subtle but unmistakable message about continuity, discipline, and legacy. In that reading, Louise is not simply a beneficiary of tradition, but a living embodiment of it. Yet this idea reportedly unsettled certain senior aides, who feared that such symbolism could reopen wider scrutiny over inheritance structures across the monarchy at a time when institutional transparency was already under intense public focus. As the story spread, something unexpected began to take shape outside palace control. Public sympathy for Louise reportedly surged across Britain, not because of controversy, but because of restraint. In a landscape often dominated by louder royal narratives, her silence became a point of fascination. Social media discussions quickly drew comparisons between her and more publicly visible younger royals, framing her not through visibility, but through composure. And in that contrast, a new image of royal expectation quietly began to form. Insiders now whisper that certain palace figures may have underestimated how strongly the public would respond to her position. What was assumed to be a contained family matter instead evolved into a broader conversation about duty, inheritance, and the emotional weight of legacy. Meanwhile, staff at Balmoral reportedly remained unwavering in their loyalty to Philip's original vision, viewing the reaction not as disruption, but as confirmation that his values still resonated beyond his lifetime. As speculation intensified, questions began to shift from what had been decided to what Louise's future role within the monarchy might ultimately become. Not through formal appointment, but through perception, expectation, and the emotional authority now attached to her name. And within palace walls, that shift reportedly created a level of uncertainty that even seasoned advisors struggled to fully anticipate. Yet, even amid the media frenzy and palace anxiety, the deepest impact of Philip's decision was still unfolding quietly behind closed doors. The moment news of the Trustees' confirmation leaked beyond royal circles, the atmosphere inside the palace reportedly shifted from guarded secrecy to full containment mode. What had once been treated as a private family matter was suddenly becoming an international royal controversy surrounding Lady Louise Windsor, the legacy of Prince Philip, and the deeply symbolic weight of Balmoral Castle. According to sources close to palace operations, communications teams allegedly moved with unusual urgency as headlines began escalating beyond expected boundaries. What started as quiet speculation in royal forums quickly transformed into a global narrative, one that palace advisors could no longer contain through routine briefing strategy. S insider suggests that every line released, every carefully phrased statement, was designed not just to clarify, but to control a growing perception that something far more significant than inheritance was unfolding within the House of Windsor. Royal commentators soon began debating a more uncomfortable possibility: whether Philip had intended this reaction all along. Some interpretations suggest the Duke's decision, rather than being purely personal, may have carried a subtle but unmistakable message about continuity, discipline, and legacy. In that reading, Louise is not simply a beneficiary of tradition but a living embodiment of it. Yet this idea reportedly unsettled certain senior aides, who feared that such symbolism could reopen wider scrutiny over inheritance structures across the monarchy at a time when institutional transparency was already under intense public focus. As the story spread, something unexpected began to take shape outside palace control. Public sympathy for Louise reportedly surged across Britain, not because of controversy, but because of restraint. In a landscape often dominated by louder royal narratives, her silence became a point of fascination. Media discussions quickly drew comparisons between her and more publicly visible younger royals, framing her not through visibility, but through composure. And in that contrast, a new image of royal expectation quietly began to form. Insiders now whisper that certain palace figures may have underestimated how strongly the public would respond to her position. What was assumed to be a contained family matter instead evolved into a broader conversation about duty, inheritance, and the emotional weight of legacy. Meanwhile, staff at Balmoral reportedly remained unwavering in their loyalty to Philip's original vision, viewing the reaction not as disruption, but as confirmation that his values still resonated beyond his lifetime. As speculation intensified, questions began to shift from what had been decided to what Louise's future role within the monarchy might ultimately become. Not through formal appointment, but through perception, expectation, and the emotional authority now attached to her name. And within palace walls, that shift reportedly created a level of uncertainty that even seasoned advisors struggled to fully anticipate. Yet even amid the media frenzy and palace anxiety, the deepest impact of Philip's decision was still unfolding quietly behind closed doors.